Hello and welcome to the first of our Loresworn Dev Diary breakdowns, where we're going to be going through dev diaries for some of the games that we enjoy and cover on the channel and talking about them. Today we're looking at the Hearts of Iron 4 Waking the Tiger expansion dev diary about how Japan is being reworked.
And this is a good idea.
Yeah, DM was you were just talking to me before we started this about how Japan needs fixing in Hearts of Iron right now.
It's Hearts of Iron, first of which, disclaimer, Hearts of Iron was on both of our Game of the Year lists here. It came out. It's a masterful game. It really is. As far as macro World War II strategy goes, what a difficult position to be in, modeling such a complicated conflict. But Japan has been broken since release, in that if you play a challenging game of Hearts of Iron, right? You crank up the difficulty, crank up, the nation power so they're a little more appropriate, right?
Don't play Germany or Soviet Union or the US.
Japan really doesn't have a good road to victory.
Yeah.
I feel like it's the one nation that has clashed the most with its historical iteration, which was, it was, didn't take long to become the most dominant Axis sea power.
Yeah.
Had us on the ropes after Pearl Harbor. I mean, Midway was a great American victory, but also something of a haymaker on the chin. It was the big punch we needed to land, and we also forget that we really needed to land a big punch. That battle gone differently, we could have been in some serious freaking trouble.
The other problem is Japan has, for a long time, just kind of broken the entire war if you're playing on the Allied side. Just because of how the factions were set up and the fact that for some reason the AI just seems like it can never figure out invading island nations. Look at our Australia run where they'd send 2 divisions down and just run around until we killed them.
Here's the thing: we quit the Australia run because we lost our entire military trying to invade. I believe it was Okinawa.
Yeah.
So the fact that we, as Australia and New Zealand, rolled the Japanese back to their home island with only what amounted to nominal support from the United States Navy. The United States Navy was winning some naval battles there, but
we wouldn't have gotten to the islands without them.
And not to discredit the Anzacs' contribution to the war, it was considerable, but if it was just the Anzacs with a couple of U.S. destroyers and carriers, they would not have been a match for the entire might of Imperial Japan.
Yeah.
And I feel like that needs fixing to make Japan more realistic and a bigger player in the metagame of Hearts of Iron. So I'm glad they're responding to it, because you basically have to crank Japan. You have, those bonus bars you click to make, you basically have to max out Japan to even make it worth thinking about.
Right,
and playing it is a headache.
And here's what they've decided to do. So after talking to QA, they are redoing the entire nation, basically.
And
They've
should.
completely redone their focus tree. I'll be showing some of the full focus tree throughout this video, but you can always go check it out and follow along if you want. It's definitely a vanilla Hearts of Iron focus tree versus a Kaiserreich focus tree, in that it's very wide and not incredibly deep. But that's kind of a good thing sometimes. So they've expanded the focus tree. Basically, the first big decision you're going to make now is whether or not you want to support the Kodoha faction, who basically, from what I understand, the little reading I've done prior to recording this, they wanted to roll back the Meiji Restoration, kind of, and put the military back in charge of the government, which is kind of an interesting thought. And
I mean, tension. I don't know that it was ever such a strong thing that it, in real life, that we're talking about, it becomes a focus. But those tensions were very real in the Japanese government. Very real.
Yeah.
In fact, it came down to the end of the war. The military didn't want to surrender.
Yeah.
The emperor ended up spending literally the last political capital he had to end that conflict without further bloodshed. It nearly tipped.
Yeah.
In the final desperate days of the war, it nearly tipped. The military, from what I've read, it's hard to describe how close. We just don't have that documentation, but there were rumblings of a coup.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to have a focus tree that's you know what? we'll make it happen, and we'll make it happen early enough in the conflict or the pre-conflict to have it actually have an impact on how the war was conducted. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested to see what this modern shogunate focus does.
Yes.
Now, here's the interesting thing about this, though. If you do support the Kodoha faction, it locks off war with China, and you're pretty much locked into a war with the Soviet Union, which is interesting. I guess maybe Russo-Japanese revanchism plays a role in that.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like after the Russo-Japanese War, Japan always viewed Russia as A, a natural rival for interests in that region, and B, just as importantly, a beatable natural rival for tensions in that region. They could exert a lot more naval and military power in the Pacific than the Soviets could.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense that a militarized Japan decides to look at that as a chance to take on a Western power, or it's funny, calling the Soviet Union a Western power, but take on one of the other
European
5 or 6.
I would call them a European power.
Well, let's be real. One of the 5 or 6 most powerful nations on Earth scored decisive victories over them in a theater of war that I think Stalin would have had a hard time justifying devoting a ton of resources to with what was going on in the West. Like, can you imagine the Soviets in 1940 being like, yeah, we're going to have to divert everything to deal with the Japanese? No way, not on your life.
Well, the other interesting thing is that if you do go this route, you kind of have to keep the Allies from meddling, because presumably their interests are aligned at least somewhat with the Soviet Union.
Yes.
At least after Hitler stabs Molotov-Ribbentrop and tosses it in the garbage. So there's this London Naval Treaty focus that basically gives Britain some of your dockyards, which kind of sucks.
But keeps them out of your way.
How big of a navy do you really need if you're fighting the Soviet Union, over eastern Siberia? Probably not that big of a deal.
And the huge deal is keeps the UK off your back.
Right. The
one other navy on the planet other than the United States Navy that can give you a headache. Worth noting.
Right. Now, this is huge. Japan will no longer join the Axis if you take their historical path. The reasoning they give for this: the cooperation between Japan and Germany does not fit neatly into our current faction system. While Japan did join the Tripartite Pact, it did not join the war against the Soviet Union. Indeed, the Germans concealed preparations to attack the Soviet Union from their Asian allies. While there was some military cooperation, exchange of technical know-how, it wasn't anything like the scale to which the Western Allies cooperated.
Or Germany and Italy.
And indeed, closer to the military cooperation between the Allies and the Soviet Union. So if you go the historical path, instead of joining the Axis, it creates a set of mutual guarantees between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Basically a defensive alliance, which they say is a lot closer to the relevant Article 4 of the treaty. I agree.
Agree 100% with that analysis.
I mean, it's not perfect, but as they say further down, I think it fixes more problems than it creates.
It makes a ton of sense gameplay-wise, and I think it's a smart gameplay decision that is also defensible historically.
Yeah.
Germany and Japan were allies, but they were far from close. Well, and in fact, they did a terrible job of cooperating and coordinating. Like, can you imagine a coordinated, and I mean intimately coordinated, like what we did with the UK when we launched D-Day? That stands, I think, in history as one of the most towering coalitional examples. What if Japan and Germany pincer the Soviet Union in an invasion that coordinated?
Yeah.
It's a different conflict.
Yeah.
That's tide-changing stuff.
Yeah.
Like, that's a tide-changing hypothetical. So that they didn't even think about doing this, and in fact harbored a lot of distrust for each other, and in fact there were musings about, okay, after we're done with this, we're going to wait a few years and then we're going to fight each other. There were a lot of people in both governments who assumed that Japan and Germany would go to war eventually.
It's man in the high castle. Eventually, they're going to come into conflict.
I think this makes sense historically and gameplay-wise.
And I love that it eliminates this problem that's existed since launch where you could not have victory in Europe until you took Tokyo, which was just silly.
Yes.
Like those peace treaties should not be as linked as they are currently.
Well, and VE Day was extremely significant historically.
Yeah.
Let's be real. The UK was not about to.
Yeah.
They helped us a lot in the Pacific with supplies, support, reconnaissance, but the war with Japan was mostly the United States versus Japan.
Yeah.
The UK support was nominal, and Soviet support in the tail end of the days was quite literally token.
It's also, and this is why I argue they should add more ideologies like Kaiserreich has, Japanese militarism in the 1930s and 40s is not really the same thing as European fascism. They were never really on the same page ideologically.
Nah, they were.
It's an utterly different cultural context.
They were a modern iteration of a medieval imperialist government.
Yeah.
It's really kind of unique, frankly, in world history, in modern contemporary world history. They were their own thing.
Yeah. So that's going to be cool. So simulating the war in China, this is kind of where I feel like maybe they are going a direction of inserting gameplay mechanics because the AI can't figure its shit out. So basically Japan is going to have penalties specifically when fighting Chinese divisions to keep them from rolling China. That they can get rid of those penalties by taking decisions that increase world tension to like escalate
I feel like you have to do this gameplay wise because you're coming out with an expansion play as China.
Yeah.
And China got its shit pushed in pretty hard by Japan, and I think you have to do something to make that not inevitable.
Well,
you know what I mean?
As a player, China, I feel like defeating Japan, there are ways to do it already. I think what they're more worried about here is that it's going to be too easy to take on AI China. Or as a player, China, it's easy enough to take on Japan if you know what you're doing. I think they're worried that if you're playing as Japan, China's just going to be a pushover, which usually it is in the current system. So, let's see. Attacking the Kadoha faction. Okay, yeah, so it represents disdain the Japanese military held their opponents in, basically. The more you go all in against China, the more you increase world tension. So I guess that's kind of interesting. You can see if you can take China even with those penalties and not become such of a bad boy on the world stage.
I think it's gameplay. I think that's more gameplay than anything. Mm-hmm. I see their logic.
Yeah. So they're getting a democratic branch where you banish the militarists to Manchuria and turn the emperor into a European-style constitutional monarch. Of course, you'll have to fight a civil war for that, which will then allow you to, once you have the constitution set up, you can either rekindle the Anglo-Japanese alliance from World War I or set up kind of a democratic West Pacific anti-communist defense organization. Now, the funniest part about this is that this democratic path can actually lead to war with the U.S.
Yep.
Because it ends with demanding full sovereignty for the Philippines.
Which the United States would not have taken lying down.
Yeah, if the U.S. refuses that, you can have democratic Japan versus democratic U.S. in a war for the Pacific for the sovereignty of the South Pacific states. Which
hypothetically, I think that makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, that's a really interesting path. I'm really interested to see what that's going to look like.
Quick clarifier. Now they can't, when I say that the UK support for the war in the Pacific was nominal, I mean UK support, not ANZAC.
Right.
I tend to think of the Commonwealth as its own thing.
It like by World War II, it kind of was.
Yeah, the ANZAC contribution to WW2 in the Pacific was absolutely tremendous.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify that. Mainly, I studied abroad in New Zealand. I love them. All the respect in the world. Want to make sure I give those props.
So then, probably the least historically plausible, there's the communist branch now, where you invite the exiled officers that were purged during the purges of the Japanese Communist Party earlier in the 1930s. You can bring them back. Once again, the militarists will flee to Manchuria. You have to fight a civil war.
Now we're kind of getting into Harry Turtledove fiction sort of territory.
It is fan
but
fiction.
Fun.
It creates some interesting decisions, though. Like, you have to figure out how to rebuild your national spirit after abolishing, the emperorship that has held the country together for over 1,000 years. You decide the fate of the imperial family. You can decide to go with Mao or with Stalin. Very, very, very alt history here, but Hearts of Iron
probably the first one we'll play for
history.
a video.
Yeah, so. Hearts of Iron is a fun alt history game, so I'm glad they encouraged that.
Well, as far as the sort of, I feel like every major nation in Hoy has like the left field focus tree.
Right.
As far as the left field focus tree goes, they could have done a lot worse than that one.
And I love that. I don't know if you've read the Germany dev diary, but they're adding a left field one for Germany to bring the Kaiser back from the Netherlands and reestablish the monarchy, which is going to be amazing. That's hilarious, and I love it. So we might do another Kaiser run at some point with that. Now here is where this is like kind of what I see as like the central flavor of Japan in World War II. Like what was going on domestically is this rivalry between the Army and the Navy. It was huge. It was absolutely huge.
Arguably the single biggest internal thing that hurt their war effort.
Yeah, they were not. These branches were not united. They were two. In
fact, you could argue they were in some ways opposed.
Yeah, they were two institutional armed forces that didn't like to cooperate, and yet somehow had to make the war effort work.
Whose officers even kind of had open disdain for one another. Pretty weird. Yeah. Honestly, it's an interesting element of World War II in my opinion. It's like how successful Imperial Japan was with the most dysfunctional military of them all. Yeah. And I say even more dysfunctional than Italy. Italy's dysfunction came from incompetence.
Yeah.
Right? Japan's dysfunction came from the fact that their branches could not get on the same page to save their life. I love that they have a mechanic for this.
Yeah,
it shows historical savvy, and based on what I'm reading, I think it's masterful game design. I think it's tremendously well modeled.
It's great. So you basically have these decisions to prioritize how your resources are used. If you go too far one way or the other, you could completely lose the support of the Army or the Navy, which is not great. But it's it's a trade-off. You get penalties and bonuses depending on what you pick. I'm hoping there are going to be a lot of events tied to this as well. This is like when I think about playing the high-level war effort of Japan in World War II. This is exactly what I wanted to see. Is more stuff about this inter-service rivalry. They've also added. I don't know if we went past it or not. So they've changed it up. How Japan can exit the war. I don't know why I can't find this part of the dev diary. I've probably scrolled past it like 6 times. Basically, they have an option to give an unconditional surrender if they've been nuked twice and don't hold land on the continent, I think. So I'm going to look for Manchuria. Okay, here we go.
AI
Japan will now surrender if they've been nuked twice. Here it is. Or lost Manchuria and Korea when they aren't holding any territory in China. So
that makes a ton of sense.
A player has the option to fight to the bitter end, but the AI will always surrender if this condition is fulfilled.
Makes a lot of sense.
Again, at first I was like, it seems like you're looking for a way to get around the fact that the AI still is bad at invading islands, but it does make sense. I
think it makes sense.
At that point they are defeated.
It's either surrender or face annihilation, which is what is the nuclear response, or our goals for going to war to begin with have completely been rolled back. It's time to exit.
Yeah.
Like if you obliterate Japan's holdings outside of its home islands and including all of its continental presence, even the most radical of Japanese governments in that context would be like, what is the point?
Yeah.
Like, surrender, save lives, save ships, save planes, fight another day. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Definitely. And this patch is basically going to kill the World War II dragging out into 1948 because Japan is being stubborn, and that overall is a good thing. Also, they mentioned Pearl Harbor is no longer a focus on the tree. It's now a decision. So you can't send spies to Japan and be like, oh, they're working on the Pearl Harbor focus. I better move my ships out of Pearl Harbor. It's legitimately going to be a surprise attack because they just click a button and it happens. I assume they'll have to have some number of ships in a certain area,
probably a small chance of failure.
Probably. So that I like. They have also added bicycle battalions, which, believe it or not, were used in World War II. They're basically infantry with, I think, slightly higher speed. They also have extremely good reliability, because, you know, fixing a bike is not that difficult.
And bikes don't, if they're designed properly and built well, bikes don't break.
No, I'm hoping...
What's the worst that can happen? A flat tire?
Yeah. So these are unique to Japan for now, but I'm hoping they'll eventually add them to, like, Belgium and the Netherlands, so you can have the all-bike world conquest is something I expect to see after this expansion comes out. Torpedo cruisers, which were a fad in the Japanese Navy, who refitted a number of light cruisers with no less than 40 torpedo tubes, 20 per broadside. So they can be very terrifying if you can manage to lure the enemy into a decisive surface battle. That's interesting that they're creating like specific types of craft for specific nations. I would actually be fine if they did more of that.
Oh, I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't like we all fought with cookie-cutter armies,
right?
Cookie-cutter navies.
Right.
Individual combatants in World War II had tons of character, flavor. I mean, look at the difference between Soviet armor and everybody else's armor, particularly in the war's late stages. The Japanese Navy and the United States Navy looked completely different. In fact, our Navy being more intelligently put together for the needs of the conflict is one of the reasons the tide turned against Japan so fast. After Midway, the United States Navy rolled the Imperial Japanese Navy because we focused on carriers, which turned out to be the important ship, whereas Japan tried to build a more balanced Navy. Well, once we rebuilt our carriers and damaged theirs, they couldn't resist us. I mean, Leyte Gulf was inevitable. I don't actually think after Midway, Japan won a meaningful naval engagement.
Not that I know of.
In fact, every time they came to grips meaningfully with our Navy, they suffered horrendous losses and barely dealt.
I'm not an expert on the war in the Pacific, but not that I know of.
I'm just saying that kind of character makes sense because they were different.
Yeah.
They were very different.
A couple little things from the dev responses in the comments. They're talking about they'd love to have different branches for navalized versions of land-based planes instead of just like you research a P-51 and then you research the carrier version of the P-51, because that's not really how it worked, like in the U.S. specifically.
No.
Our carrier planes were actually contracted to a completely different company than our land-based aircraft were, so that would make sense to split those up. Some of the Japanese focuses will unlock new design companies, which is going to be interesting in the Army versus Navy dispute. People are concerned about the nuke rule with Japan. It has to be on Japanese core territory. You can't just drop nukes on Manchuria and expect them to surrender.
That makes sense.
So overall, I'm pretty positive about this. I think they did a really good job with Japan. Maybe even better than what they've done to change Germany up.
It needed to happen. Japan was badly broken.
Yeah.
It just was. And again, I think stuff like this is a great example of what makes Paradox a special company. You know, their games are always good at release, but rarely great. But with most other studios, if they release a good game, that's all. They've released a good game, they move on to the sequel or DLC. With Paradox games, they're good game. They always release a good game, and it always becomes great. And quite a few of them, like EU4 being the best example, become legendary. And I love that they do stuff like this. You know, it was a fix that needed to happen, but it didn't need to happen to... You had a 9 out of 10 game.
Yeah.
Like, do you need a 9.1? But...
Yeah.
Heck yeah. And I admire, as a creative professional myself and a businessman, I admire that.
Yeah.
That is... It's rare, and it's admirable, and... even though I'm not half as big into grand strategy as you are, it's why I continue to buy dang near everything they release.
Well, and it really, for me, it's the best counter argument to the people who complain about how much DLC they put out and how much they charge for DLC.
It's all meaningful, though.
The fact that it's funding continued updates like this when so few companies would put this much time into a game after release, I'm very, very
what are their major titles right now?
Happy to pay, $15 every 3 or 4 months to keep that.
It's Stellaris, it's CK2, it's Hoi 4, it's EU4.
Yeah.
4 games, right? You can count, I think, on your fingers. When we're referring to, I think at this point, we've got to be close to, if not over 100 pieces of DLC and patches and major updates like this for all 4.
I mean, yeah, EU4 is on patch 22 right now.
Yeah,
CK2 is in the 20s.
We've got to be approaching 3 figures.
Yeah.
You can count on your fingers the amount of ones that have been meh. I don't think any of them have been bad.
Yeah.
There've been a couple meh, a couple of EU4 ones where it's
Yeah, didn't really do much, but yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not just, hey, $15 for this. It's all meaningful.
Yeah.
It's all good.
I don't think there's been a single patch for EU4 where there hasn't been at least one thing in the patch notes I was pretty excited about.
Well, it's look at what they're doing with Stellaris.
Yeah.
Literally everything they are doing to that game is making it a better game.
We're going to have to just do a roundup of all of the Stellaris 1.5 dev diaries and just talk about how awesome they are at some point.
We're so excited for them.
Yeah.
When Stellaris released,
those of you that
it's the Paradox formula. When Stellaris launched, it was a good game.
Yeah.
Leviathan, Synthetic Dawn, Utopia, they made it a very good game. Now they're going to make it a great game. What's coming for Stellaris will make it a great game.
Those of you that have
classic Paradox.
Those of you that keep asking when are the killer robots coming back? They're coming back after the patch when it is made viable to play as an aggressive militarist civilization, which is exactly what this patch is going to do.
I'll say this: when it's made viable to play an aggressive militarist civilization that doesn't get lucky.
Yeah,
I have won Stellaris games as fanatic purifiers, but those wins always come attached with a healthy amount of luck.
Yeah.
And we're talking multiple things rolling in my favor.
Yeah, oh look, I spawned next to the Curator Fallen Empire. My entire strategy's fucked.
that being the big one. If you spawn by a bunch of pacifist pushovers, and you get lucky with some of your early techs, and you get lucky with some of your early research quests, it's viable. But in almost any other occasion, you're either getting your shit pushed in early or you're getting your shit pushed in by the mid game.
Yeah.
And Stellaris is making any build viable. So yeah, I just want to give a quick shout out because man, Paradox, you do it right.
Yep.
I would like to see more studios adopt your model. To be frank.
I would love for almost every game I play to adopt the Paradox model, to be honest. I mean, it has some problems. EU4, has seen some feature bloat, some features that haven't gotten the love they need because they're a DLC feature, and they don't want to make them essential, which also means that they can't make them as good as they could be. But overall, it's a great model. I love it. Looking forward to this expansion. It's the first Hearts of Iron 4 expansion I'm really excited for. I feel like it's adding more cool stuff than the previous 2 expansions put together and doubled don't even equal to the amount of cool stuff that's being added.
And we're looking forward to doing more videos like this.
Yep.
I like more analytic content where we can talk about things. It's just fun.
Yeah, expect more dev diary breakdowns in the future, and look forward to some of our upcoming gaming series, including a new Hearts of Iron and new Stellaris when their respective expansions release.
Now that we're in 2018, that clock is ticking, audibly. So cool, that's coming soon.
And we'll see you around.